Hi, I'm Femi OK. On today's bonus edition of The Stream, some of the best conversations we've aired on TV and a few we had after you, dear viewer, had stopped watching. Like the time that activist Linda Sossour and upfront host Mark Lamont Hill got talking about the risks of being outspoken supporters of Palestinians. That conversation is coming up later. And we revisit the Tulsa Race Massacre of 1921. It was so bloody and shameful that the story of a white mob killing hundreds of African Americans wasn't taught in school for decades. Let's start in Ethiopia. Reports of rape being used as a weapon of war in the Tigray region were the starting point for a discussion on The Stream. We always invite the Office of Ethiopia's Prime Minister to participate in The Stream. Unfortunately, the office has a policy of only taking part in one-on-one interviews and not engaging with discussion shows. But we know they watch The Stream's Ethiopia episodes. So, after the live show about sexual violence in the Tigray conflict had ended, I asked the guests what message they would like to send directly to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. Here's what they had to say.
What's happening in Tigray is a clear breach of international humanitarian law, so we would definitely call on all parties to the conflict to ensure that international humanitarian law is not being breached. Further, humanitarian organizations need unfettered access to all the areas affected so that we're able to reach those civilians, especially women and girls, especially in the rural areas where we've not had access to be able to reach them and be able to provide support necessary as well.
Zaina, the Prime Minister's office is watching right now. What do you want to tell them?
What I would say is the time to hide, that saying that law and order in Tigray, the time you went after Oromia for 2 years without anybody saying. Jawar Mohammed, who brought you to power, is in prison. Thousands of Kero who died for you are in prison or are they're dead already. The time to hide and lie is over. It is a matter of time that you face the reality and start national dialogue and allow unfettered investigation across the country, not just in Tigray, across the country where thousands of other people relinquish in prison. And, I think you must face the reality. I think is you no longer can. He's a Nobel Peace Prize winner and he think he can still write that, but those days are long gone. He needs to wake up.
Maza.
We know everything that's happening to the people of Tigray is aimed at subjugating us and denying our right to self-determination. No matter how difficult and tough the circumstances, the people of Tigray will continue to defend their right to self-determination. Any sane government, any sane leader that wants to see peace and coexistence within Ethiopia would realize the right and strengths of the people of Tigray and stop the genocidal war that it has waged on the people. The government would work to withdraw the foreign forces that are in Tigray and give unfettered and unrestricted humanitarian access so that the people of Tigray could have a chance at a national, inclusive and peaceful dialogue.
So that conversation is continuing online across all of The Stream's social media platforms. Please keep sharing your thoughts with us, even if it means that you totally take over my Twitter notifications. We see you, Ethiopia. Your feedback makes every show better. And now to The Stream's Instagram Live series for a conversation about Palestinians, watermelons, and celebrities. Bear with me. It's all going to make sense after you see the reporter's diary from Al Jazeera West Bank correspondent Nida Ibrahim.
It's not necessarily the case. Many of them may not know a lot about Palestine, but they know that there are people who are still living under Israeli occupation. And for many Palestinians here, they would tell you that solidarity is important, not because of the fact if they know what's going on or if they don't know, but because there has been for a long time some sort of a stigma that sticks to people who are labeled as pro-Palestinian or those who are exposing the reality under occupation. This is why many Palestinians here are enthusiastic that they're even on the agenda, that they felt that for so many years their case was put on the shelf and they weren't even relevant to the international community. So the mere fact that the people are speaking about what's going on in Palestine has been viewed here, has been welcomed here by many Palestinians and viewed here as a success, even if many of them might not know.
On Twitter, your Twitter account is @Nida_Ibrahim, and in your Twitter profile it says you live to tell stories, you love telling stories.
pick one story you have told this year that you loved telling.
Just to point out that my story, my Twitter handle is @Nita_Giorno, JOURNO. That's fine. I'm going to tell you something. There is a story that I'm dying to tell that I'm still working on.
All right, Nita, but can you put it out there, because you know those correspondents out there, the sneaky ones. They're going to be writing this down and they're going to be doing it. They'll do it tonight, Nita, before you can even do it tomorrow. Are you sure you want to share it? I want to hear the scoop.
Okay, so
all right,
I'll tell you. I'll tell you.
Other reporters out there.
It's about a representation of the Palestinian flag through a watermelon. So the story goes back to the 1967 or after the Israeli occupation. And back then, many Palestinian artists weren't even allowed to show and portray the Palestinian flag. And one a group of artists that I've spoken to, and they're in their 70s, they were telling me that when they met with the Israeli officer who closed down their gallery for what he said with political work and political activism, he told them that they should be painting flowers or painting other things. And they said, okay, what if we paint flowers, but they have the Palestinian flag's colors on them, red, green, black, and white. And the officer says, not even a watermelon. So what one Palestinian artist that I've spoken to, his name is Khalid Hourani, when he was asked to do an atlas and a map of Palestine and talk about Palestinians, it was called the Subjective Atlas for Palestine. He chose the watermelon as a representation of the flag to kind of mock the Israeli soldier who said that you couldn't be painting the Palestinian flag. And what has been happening lately in these recent escalations is that young Palestinian artists have took on the story, and they breathed more life into it, and now it became a symbol of Palestinian resistance and Palestinian struggle. So if you're seeing in your Instagram many Palestinians posting watermelons, now you know that story.
I see them. There's rows of watermelons going on right now. Palestinian flags and then rows of watermelon. When are you doing that story?
Yeah, we're working on it. It's going to be soon on Al Jazeera, hopefully.
Right.
But yeah, it's for me, it's telling these simple stories about Palestinians' lives. It's not just about, one settlement here and one. Of course, this is a reality and we have to keep telling it. But we also have to keep the story relevant, and it's a challenge. So we try to always find ways to keep the audience engaged and interested to hear stories about what's going on here in Palestine.
Nida Ibrahim on her mission to keep her reporting interesting. Thanks, Nida. We stay in Palestine for a look behind the scenes of a recent stream episode about the solidarity between the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States and Palestinians. After the live broadcast, guests Linda Sassour and Mark Lamont Hill talked about the danger of being outspoken Palestinian activists.
The most dangerous, it's really interesting because when people ask that question, I'm always hesitant because Palestinians pay such a high price every day. Mm-hmm. Just being Palestinian is a risk. And so the type of risks that many of us take professionally are significant, but they're relatively minuscule in comparison to the Palestinians whose very lives are on the line every single day. But when I think about throughout history, some of the moments, you think about Andrew Young meeting with the PLO in the 1970s. He was fired as a U.S. ambassador. Did he know that would be what's at stake? I don't know. But he certainly took the risk, right? I think about the risk that candidates like Bernie Sanders have taken when they stand up and speak out in support of Palestinian rights and saying that, hey, maybe just throwing it out here, maybe if Israel continues to violate international law and basic human rights, maybe we should condition our funding on them not doing that. These are big risks when you're running for president. And so I'm not saying Bernie Sanders is the biggest risk taker, and I'm not saying that Andy Young was the biggest risk taker. I'm saying these are just examples of the kind of risks that people take. Because if you're watching this outside of the United States, then you have to understand that in mainstream American politics and mainstream American media, taking a position of criticism against the Israeli government is a very, very unpopular opinion. The same level of consensus we see in the international courts and in the UN and in most nations against, say, settlement expansion or moving the embassy to Jerusalem, it's the inverse in the United States in terms of support. If you want to be president, you have to say, I support Israel, and it's our ally, no matter what. If you're going to, sometimes if you want to run for governor, if you want to run for a local election.
It's like kissing a baby, Mark, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
It's just a taken for granted assumption, and it's one that's beginning to change, as Linda said, when we see people like Ilhan Omar, when we see people like Rashida Tlaib, when we see people like Jamal Bowman come up and speak, and Cori Bush speak out, it's changing the dynamics for us on the ground.
I love that we have you on a split screen because, Mark, you speak from your perspective. Linda, when I ask about risk, the risk that you take to be boldly, unapologetically Palestinian in a United States that is only just maybe just understanding the Palestinian cause?
For me, Femi, I think about a speech that Dr. Martin Luther King gave a few days before he was assassinated. He was telling the people that he may not get to the promised land, that he sees the promised land, but he may not get there. And he didn't get there. And I believe the same. I may not see a free Palestine in my lifetime, but I know that the seeds that I plant today will bear fruit for generations to come. I wake up in the morning controversial just for being Palestinian. I don't have to say anything. I don't have to tweet anything. Doing this work is risky. It risks your livelihood. For me, it's risked my life many times, and including the lives of my children. But I know that there are people who are counting on me. My great-great-grandmothers, my ancestors count on me. And if it's not for people like me and others in our community, Palestine wouldn't continue to even be a thing, because every single day our land is being stolen. Every day we just have less and less and less of our land. So it takes people like us to continue this conversation and to continue to fight for the liberation of our people. So everything's worth it. My life is worth it for this. My life is worth it for Black people. And for some of us, we're just not afraid. So I'm willing to, have everything taken from me. And I will continue to speak truth to power no matter the consequences. And that is what we've been taught here in the United States by the greats like Malcolm X, and also by the greats of folks from around the world who have literally sacrificed their lives for freedom.
100 years ago this month, mobs of white people attacked Black Americans living in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. They ransacked and torched homes and businesses and fired at Black people with machine guns. Planes even dropped bombs on civilians. More than 10,000 people were left homeless and hundreds were killed in less than 24 hours. It was one of the worst race massacres in the history of the United States. On the anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, I spoke to author Carlos Moreno, Laura Pitter from Human Rights Watch, and Anneliese Bruner. Anneliese's great-grandmother, Mary E. Jones Parrish, wrote in horrifying detail about the massacre in a family memoir.
My great-grandmother had been teaching in her teaching school for typewriting and secretarial services. My grandmother, the young girl in the window, called to her mother, "Mother, I see men with guns," with a great urgency. My great-grandmother sprang to her feet, and she looked out, and she saw people advancing with torches, people passing by in automobiles with guns hanging out, committing drive-by shootings, actually. There were planes overhead, as Carlos has mentioned. And my grandmother, my great-grandmother, prayed to have guidance in as what you can well imagine was a life or death quandary. Should I remain in my home where I can be burned to death, or should I take my chances amongst the flying bullets outside? She thought it would be better, she says, to die in the street from bullet shot than to be subject of incendiary devices within her home. So she ran out onto the street. Someone cried out, "Get out of the street with that child, or you both will be killed." She ran north, seeking refuge at a house of a friend farther up. And we do know now that the entire quarter was surrounded. We talk about the guard and the divisions that were deployed. They surrounded the entire district, the entire quarter, so that they could slaughter people as they ran for their lives. So this was an act and a scene of warfare. From above, from the street, machine guns were mounted on Standpipe Hill, which juts out into the northern part of the city, and people were mowed down on the street as they ran.
This is an event that was pre-planned. The Tulsa police deputized 200 people. The National Guard supplied 2 branches, 2 divisions to evacuate the neighborhood of Greenwood. There were businessmen who supplied fuel for the airplanes that bombed this neighborhood. And so all of this, there were 3 detention camps that were set up to intern 6,000 people. So we need to understand that all of this was planned ahead of time, and all of this was done in cooperation with the city officials at the time.
You know, 100 years later, the issue is that today we still do not have any repair or restitution for what happened. Following the massacre, the authorities did nothing to prosecute anyone for the violence that took place. No restitution was provided. The people sued to try and get the insurance claims that they had for their property and their belongings. They fought for years in courts and ultimately lost that battle. But subsequent to the massacre, authorities just tried to cover it up for 100 years and did cover it up for 100 years. So that's why we don't have justice today.
So a century later, the history that so many tried to bury is resurfacing. US President Biden visited the Greenwood district and promised survivors and descendants of victims that the true and full story would be made known. Interestingly, he stayed clear of mentioning anything about reparations. But why is the US finally openly discussing the Tulsa massacre and its impact now? That's the question I posed to the guests when we started chatting after the show.
Well, I was assigned to cover Trump's visit last year to Tulsa. And, you know, here's, everything that President Trump stands for and is. Visiting Tulsa in the middle of a global pandemic. On the weekend of Juneteenth, which is a sacred celebration for African-American communities all across this country. And I think that Joe Biden's visit is a direct response and an appropriate one. And what I will be listening for from Joe Biden's visit is not just a desire to research the case for reparations. That research has been done, as Laura pointed out, 20 years ago. It has been done today by the Human Rights Watch. And so the research is done, the evidence is there, the data exists. Now is the time to take action and to do something right. And, you know, Anneliese, your great-grandmother was such an inspiration to me. I write extensively about her in my book. The type of journalism that she was doing in 1923 was not well regarded in the nation until the work of Hunter S. Thompson and similar journalists in the 1970s and 80s. And here she is doing revolutionary journalism work 50 years before it became in vogue, so to speak. The type of investigative journalism that Mary Parrish Jones did is something to be absolutely admired. I wouldn't be surprised if she receives a posthumous award for her journalism. She deserves it.
Thank you, Carlos.
Laura, what do you think is happening right now in this time?
I mean, I do think, you know, the U.S. is having some kind of racial reckoning, and not just around the massacre, but with regard to George Floyd. You know, but we did see the concept of reparations get a lot more attention even in 2019 when Ta-Nehisi Coates testified in front of Congress. And so, you know, I do think that there's more focus, and I think part of that reason is because white people are becoming more aware of what their wealth and their privilege is built on. There's just more awareness in the public space about that, and I do think there's more reckoning going on, not nearly what there needs to be. You know, there needs to be a real conversation about what's necessary to repair the harm and the damage stemming from slavery and policies that were a legacy of slavery that went straight into, you know, are straight continuing today. Here we are at the centennial. And in fact, you know, really there's been, what's remarkable is there has been no repair and no restitution for 100 years. I mean, that's really where we are right now. I think the shock of that and maybe knowledge about that is generating more momentum for what needs to happen. But I do, you know, hope that shining a spotlight on it, as we have with the centennial, will, you know, perpetuate more action, and, you know, that the spotlight will not fade as a result of the centennial ending.
All right, so Guess, I'm going to give you 30 seconds to respond to a YouTube comment. 30 seconds, and that's going to wrap us up. Laura, you go first. When Laura finishes, Carlos, you pick up, and then Anneliese. 30 seconds. Captain Late Night says, I live 3 hours from there in Texas, graduated in '86 and was not aware of it until a couple of years ago. Captain Late Night is talking about the Tulsa Race Massacre. Had no idea it happened. Laura.
Well, I hope that he does more research and studies more, because, you know, this country was built on slavery, and you know, the Tulsa Race Massacre is just one of many incidents of horrible racial violence that took place across this country. So I hope that he does more research and learns about those other incidents as well, and you know, how the wealth of this nation is built on really policies and slavery itself.
Yeah, I would agree, and I would also say we know a lot more today than we did even 20 years ago or even 5 years ago. And so I would even invite the viewer to take a look at and be inspired by the great lives of the people who lived in Greenwood, and learn about their legacy and learn about the great things that have come from Greenwood, from its music to its culture to its political and all the other influences that Greenwood has had, just not just on the city, but on the country as a whole.
What I'd say is that we need to, in the present day, be very aware and, again, very vigilant about the nature of the institution of public education in this country, and an agenda being pushed that sanitizes how we perceive ourselves as Americans. We must learn the truth so that we can assess objective reality in an efficient way. We look at Nicole Hannah-Jones, who created the 1619 Project, and as retribution, she has been denied tenure in the journalism school at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and we know that she takes a different view of the American experiment from the African American experience and viewpoint as opposed to from the other side, and that has been frowned upon.
And that's our show for today. I'll leave you with photos from the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre and scenes from the 2021 Centennial commemorations. Thanks for watching. See you next time.